General Theodor Lieb urged his exhausted horse through the freezing currents of the Niloy Tikich River, the animal's hooves thrashing against the icy water. Bullets snapped past his face as chaos unfolded around him. For 8 harrowing days, he and his men had been encircled by 200,000 Soviet troops, battered by starvation, disease, and unrelenting attacks in the frozen wasteland of the Korsun pocket. The Luftwaffe's 8th Air Corps had fought to drop supplies and evacuate the wounded, but the Soviet pincer had shattered Lieb's group as it shut down. After seeing his men succumb to frostbite, hunger, and the unending brutality of Soviet artillery, Lieb had come up with a desperate gamble. Operation Freedom, a breakout through the frozen river to link with the German 3rd Panzer Corps. It was a next to impossible mission, but it was all they had. As Lieb pressed forward, men drenched in blood, and icy water stumbled around him, fighting for their lives. Suddenly, his horse collapsed beneath him, vanishing into the freezing depths. Lieb plunged into the river, gasping as the icy water threatened to pull him under, but he surfaced with a furious will to survive. His men still followed him, and Lieb would lead them no matter the cost. By January 25, 1944, the right wing of Germany's Army Group South was barely holding on near the Korsun airfield, trying to fend off the Soviet advance. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, desperate for a way out, flew to see Hitler, pleading for a withdrawal, but the Führer stubbornly refused, clinging to the hope of a miracle. Soviet General Ivan S. Konev seized the opportunity, launching a brutal artillery barrage west of Butki that shattered the already weakened German lines. The fog grounded air support, and the weather, alternating between freezing ice and thawing mud, became an additional enemy. Soviet rifle divisions and tanks tore through the gap between the German corps, overwhelming the 389th Infantry Division. On January 28th, Konev's forces completed the encirclement at Zvenigorodka, trapping 59,000 German soldiers held by the shattered remnants of 11th Corps and 32nd Corps. Despite counterattacks, the Soviets pushed forward, reinforcing with fresh tank and cavalry units. The Germans, ensnared within the Korsun pocket, fought back fiercely, but the weather worsened. Soviet forces were jubilant. Konev declared, quote, "We've done it this time. I've got the Germans in the pincers, and I'm not letting them slip out again." The Soviets had no need to rush. They would tighten the grip, let the cold and hunger do the rest, and wait for the Germans to break. For the 59,000 trapped soldiers, the question was no longer if they would be annihilated, but when. The hell of Korsun was just beginning. The Soviets hammered the encircled Germans relentlessly, day and night. Hollow-eyed, the trapped troops clung to their defenses. The pocket tightened with each passing hour, supplies dwindled, and the German High Command watched their campaign unravel. Another prolonged encirclement could break them completely. General Wilhelm Stemmermann, now commanding Group Stemmermann, faced grim odds. With only 40 operational tanks and self-propelled guns and divisions, too depleted for offensive action, his forces were on the brink. Supplies were scarce, but horse-drawn Panjis delivered rations and ammunition from Luftwaffe transport drops. 8th Air Corps, under constant Soviet fire, risked everything to supply the pocket and evacuate the wounded. Despite the dire conditions, German soldiers fought with extraordinary bravery. At Olszana, Major Leon de Grelle and his Belgian SS Wallonian unit faced a massive Soviet assault. Refusing to retreat, de Grelle charged into enemy fire, rallying his men to hold their ground. The Walloons forced the Soviets to bleed for every frozen inch. Yet the northern edge of the pocket began to collapse. The Soviet 27th Army exploited gaps, tightening the noose. The Germans could only wait for destruction or a miracle. There was indeed a relief attempt underway, but entering that frozen hell was almost as grueling as escaping it. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein tasked General Hermann Breith's 3rd Panzer Corps with the mission. Despite scarce resources, Breith assembled an impressive force, including the 16th, 17th, and 1st SS Panzer Divisions, supported by Heavy Panzer Battalion 506 and Regiment Baker, totaling 126 tanks and assault guns. On February 4, 1944, Operation Wanda launched with ferocity. Panthers and Tigers led the assault, targeting Soviet defenses near Novaya Greblia Bagva and aiming to secure the Niloy-Tikich river crossings. However, Soviet forces forewarned and fortified their positions with the 2nd and 6th Tank Armies and the 40th Army. The battle devolved into chaos. Frozen, narrow roads trapped German tanks, while Soviet artillery and T-34s inflicted heavy losses. Bryth's forces faced overwhelming firepower, turning the operation into a brutal grind. In the heat of battle, Lieutenant Colonel Franz Barke, commanding a mixed force of Tigers and Panthers, was determined to reach the pocket. Barke was a rising tank ace known in the German army as a tactician and a natural leader. His tanks smashed through Soviet defenses, and he personally destroyed multiple enemy tanks in the fighting for Kosyakovka. Despite his valor and tactical acumen, the relentless Soviet counterattacks and treacherous terrain bogged the 3rd Panzer Corps down. Though Bryth's forces managed to penetrate Soviet lines in places, their advance faltered before reaching the encircled troops. The cost in men and machines mounted, and with each passing day, the chance of a successful breakout for Group Stemmermann diminished. By February 10th, the German forces trapped in the Korsun pocket were fighting against the inevitable. Encircled by 2 Soviet fronts and hemmed in by a relentless winter, the pocket had shrunk to a desperate triangle of resistance. With the villages of Morinci, Stebliv, and Korsun at its vertices, the once sprawling defensive line had been reduced to a grim prison for 59,000 German troops. Despite the dire situation, the Luftwaffe's 8th Air Corps clung to their mission. Night after night, transport planes braved artillery fire to deliver supplies to the Korsun airfield, even as it fell within Soviet gun range. Hope now rested on a relief attempt by General Hermann Bryth's 3rd Panzer Corps, whose armored columns fought tooth and nail to break through the Soviet stranglehold. On February 13th, Major Franz Barke's armored task force, spearheading the relief effort, pressed forward. With elements of the 16th Panzer Division covering his left flank, Barke launched an assault toward the village of Dashukivka. The advance was methodical but punishing as Soviet forces unleashed ambushes and counterattacks. When 2 T-34 tanks were spotted moving suspiciously into a small depression, Barke's instincts took over. Suspecting an ambush, he called for Stuka dive bombers. German tanks fired white flares to mark the targets, and moments later, the sky filled with the deafening roar of Stukas diving into action. Soviet tanks, hidden in the depression, were flushed out and obliterated by Barke's 88mm guns, fired with precision from 2,000 yards. As more T-34s emerged to outflank the Tigers, Barke's Panthers and additional tanks from the 16th Panzer Division engaged in a fierce duel. The battlefield was chaos, blizzards of snow mixed with smoke and the shriek of artillery. By the end of the day, the Germans claimed to have destroyed 70 Soviet tanks and 40 anti-tank guns, with a loss of 5 Tigers and 4 Panthers. The villages of Dashukivka, Chesnovka and Kijinci fell into German hands, a rare tactical success amid the broader disaster. An impressed Field Marshal, Erich von Manstein, sent an encouraging message to 3rd Panzer Corps. Quote, "Bravo! Despite the mud and Russians, already much has been accomplished. Now it is about the last step. Teeth together and forward." But the advance stalled near the eastern bank of the Niloy-Tikich River, not from lack of firepower, but due to dwindling fuel reserves and unrelenting Soviet resistance. That night, only 3 of Barke's 20 Panthers were operational. Inside the Korsun pocket, General Wilhelm Stemmermann faced a grim reality. Resources were nearly gone, casualties were mounting, and the Soviet grip was asphyxiating. 3rd Panzer Corps would not reach them in time. On February 16th, he made a harrowing decision. If rescue was impossible, they would fight their way out. Field Marshal Manstein's orders were stark. Quote, "Password freedom, objective Lysianka, 2300 hours. Stemmermann responded resolutely, quote, "We have no other chance. It is now or never." The plan was desperate, a frontal assault to breach Soviet lines, cross the freezing Gniloy-Tikich River, and link up with the 3rd Panzer Corps. Major General Theobald Lieb would lead the breakout, while Stemmermann commanded the rearguard. As night fell on February 16th, a blizzard swept across the battlefield, cloaking their movements. The breakout began with the 72nd Infantry Division, spearheaded by Major Robert Kaestner's 105th Regiment, tasked with punching a hole through Soviet defenses. The village of Shenderivka, engulfed in flames from Soviet artillery and U-2 biplane strikes, became the flashpoint. The burning inferno lit up the night as soldiers penned farewell letters before charging into the chaos. Disaster struck when a bridge collapsed under a tank's weight, creating a bottleneck. Soviet artillery and Katyusha rockets turned the village into a trap. Major Leon de Grelle of the SS Wiking Division later recalled the horror. Quote, "Gasoline trucks were burning. Horses struck down in the snow. Near them, clusters of soldiers hit by machine gun fire were coughing or lying motionless." Thousands of German troops were funneled south into the Dzierżyńcy-Poczapincy road, where the breakout became a massacre. As Kaestner's regiment pressed forward, they met entrenched Soviet defenses and waiting T-34 tanks. Brutal close-quarters combat ensued, with German soldiers resorting to bayonets and entrenching tools to clear Soviet positions. Amid the chaos, Corporal Fritz Hamann and his staff sergeant crept close enough to destroy 5 T-34s with Panzerfausts, buying precious time for the fleeing Germans. Stemmermann fell near Poczapincy when his half-track was destroyed by Soviet anti-tank fire. Morale collapsed. The final obstacle was the icy Gniloy-Tikich River, a freezing torrent that became a barrier for the escaping Germans. Exhausted soldiers waded into the water, clinging to makeshift rafts or crawling across precarious ice floes. Freezing waters and steep banks turned their retreat into a fight for survival. Under relentless Soviet artillery fire, soldiers tried to cross the icy, fast-moving river. Hamann crawled onto the ice, which cracked beneath him. After clinging to floes for half an hour, he was hauled out with a carbine. Behind him, his staff sergeant was swept away. Hundreds drowned as exhaustion and icy currents claimed their lives in the desperate crossing. General Theodor Lieb, one of the last to attempt to escape, urged his horse into the icy river, bullets snapping past as chaos engulfed the retreating Germans. When his horse collapsed beneath him, Lieb plunged into the freezing depths but emerged, dragging himself forward. He led his men, determined to escape the Korsun Pocket's frozen hell. By morning, makeshift footbridges allowed stragglers, wounded soldiers, and terrified civilians to scramble across to safety. In a remarkable show of will and endurance, Theodor Lieb had made it to the other side of the river, swimming on his own. On the eastern side of the river, 3rd Panzer Corps held the line with covering fire, but the cost was devastating. Of the 59,000 German troops encircled in the Korsun Pocket, just 28,000 managed to break out. Over 11,000 wounded were pulled out during the fighting, but 19,000 were either lost or captured. While the breakout could be seen as a small victory, it came at a terrible price. German divisions were shattered. The Soviets also paid heavily. Over 80,000 men became casualties, and 850 tanks and artillery guns were destroyed. For the survivors, the Korsun ordeal became another haunting memory in a war that was already a nightmare.